I paid one $12,000 for my husband's cremation, then his ashes called me from Miami. The voicemail is still on my phone. I've listened to it 411 times. 3 in the morning, 7 months after I held Victor's hand while it went cold, and my phone lights up with a Miami area code. His voice. Not a voice like his. His voice. That specific way he clears his throat before he speaks. That little hum he does, and then, "Ellie, why'd you change the Netflix password? I was in the middle of that documentary." 7 months after I watched them slide his casket into the cremation chamber. 7 months after I paid $112,000 for a funeral befitting a man who spent 40 years beside me. 7 months after I stood on a boat off Nantucket in November, wind that cut through my black coat and poured what I believed were his ashes into gray water. My hands were shaking so badly that some of the ash blew back onto my lips, and I tasted grit, and I thought, this is the last time any part of him will touch me. Fireplace ash. Concrete dust. That's what I tasted. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Eleanor Whitfield. I'm 64 years old. For 40 years, I served as a bankruptcy trustee for the federal courts, which means I spent my career pulling apart the financial lives of people who thought they were smarter than the system. I found hidden accounts in the Cayman Islands. I traced shell corporations through 7 layers of incorporation. I deposed men who looked me in the eye and lied with the confidence of saints, and I dismantled them with receipts. I was good at my job. I was exceptional at my job. And somehow, the most elaborate fraud I ever encountered was sleeping in my bed for 4 decades. Victor Whitfield. Pastor, as it turns out. My husband found his calling, he used to say, every time he left for what he called his seminary retreats in Florida. Monthly trips, 19 years of them. I packed his suitcase. I drove him to the airport. I kissed him goodbye at the curb and said, "Go do God's work," and I meant it. Because I believed him, because why wouldn't you believe the man who held you at your mother's funeral and told you he'd never leave you alone in this world? But before I tell you about Victor, I need to tell you about the urn. It sat on our mantel in the Philadelphia house. Mainline, 2,300 square feet of carefully maintained brick colonial that my grandmother's money paid for, though you wouldn't know that from the way Victor talked about our home and our investments and our legacy. The urn was ceramic, hand-thrown by a potter in Bucks County, glazed the color of deep water because Victor always said he wanted to be scattered at sea. I chose it because I thought it was the last beautiful thing I could do for him. For 7 months I talked to that urn. I said good morning to it. I apologized to it when I rearranged the living room, as if he'd mind. My grief counselor, Dr. Kaplan, said the attachment to the vessel was normal. She said grief doesn't follow timelines. She didn't say, "Eleanor, you're talking to concrete dust and fireplace ash while your husband teaches his 12-year-old daughter to drive in a megachurch parking lot in Miami," because she didn't know. Nobody knew. After the voicemail, I didn't sleep. My vision narrowed to a pinpoint when I heard his voice, like looking through a keyhole at a room that shouldn't exist. I sat on the edge of our bed. His side was still made up the way he liked it. Hospital corners because I couldn't bring myself to change it, because Dr. Kaplan said I wasn't ready, because every morning for 40 years Victor had said, "Ellie, I don't know why you can't get the corners right. It takes 10 seconds. You'd think after all this time you could manage 10 seconds of effort." So I made them perfect. Every morning for a dead man, for 7 months. I played the voicemail again, the Netflix password. That was the detail that did it. Not his voice from beyond the grave, not the impossibility of it, but the Netflix password. Because in 40 years of marriage, Victor never once asked me about a password. Victor didn't ask, Victor told. Victor managed the accounts, the subscriptions, the finances, the credit cards, the investment portfolio that my grandmother's inheritance funded. I didn't have the login to our own bank account for the last 11 years. When I needed groceries, I used a card he'd set up with a limit he chose. When I wanted to buy something for myself, I asked. I asked permission to spend money that came from my own family in a house my grandmother's trust purchased, and I want you to hear that clearly. Because if you've ever apologized for existing in a room your own money paid for, you already know exactly what I'm describing. You just haven't admitted it yet. The morning after the voicemail, I did something I hadn't done in 40 years. I went to work, not to an office. To my study, the small room off the kitchen that Victor called my little hobby room, where I kept my case files and my contacts and the habits of a mind trained to follow money through darkness. I sat down, I opened my laptop, and I began. 40 years of bankruptcy forensics. You don't lose that. You can retire the title, but the instinct lives in your hands. My hands remembered before my mind did. They'd been folding his laundry for 4 decades and recognized his sock brand in Celestine's photos. But that came later. That morning, I started with the flight manifests. I still held emeritus status with the court, which meant I still technically had subpoena power for open cases, and Victor's estate was technically still in probate. A thread. A thin, legal, legitimate thread. I pulled it. I pulled it for 96 hours straight while taking my grief medication on schedule, so the pharmacy records would show compliance, while answering Dr. Kaplan's check-in texts with appropriate sadness, while performing the role of widow so completely that no one, not my neighbors, not my friends, not my daughter Bethany, suspected that I had stopped grieving and started hunting. 19 years of monthly flights to Miami. The manifests were easy. Victor Whitfield, seat 14C, U.S. Airways, then American, Philadelphia to Miami, one way on Friday, returning Monday. Every month, for 19 years, 228 round trips. I calculated the cost, roughly $187,000 in airfare alone, from our accounts, from my grandmother's money. Then the church donation records. Miami Faith Tabernacle, a mega church with 14,000 online followers. Pastor Victor Whitfield, founding minister, beloved widower who raised his daughter alone after his first wife died in childbirth. That's the story he told them, that I died giving birth to Bethany. He preached sermons about my sacrifice every Mother's Day, my sacrifice. While I was alive, 60 miles from where my mother is buried, hearing his laugh in empty rooms and thinking I was losing my mind. $1.2 million in donations from our accounts to his ministry over 19 years. Categorized as charitable giving on our taxes, deducted every year. I signed those returns. Victor brought them to me with the little colored tabs marking where to sign, and I signed because he said his accountant had prepared everything, and questioning it would start a fight that would last 3 days and end with him sleeping in the guest room and telling me I didn't trust him, that my suspicion was a sickness, that I should talk to Dr. Kaplan about my controlling tendencies. My controlling tendencies. The man who set a spending limit on my grocery card accused me of being controlling, and I believed him. That's the part that still burns. I believed him. Then I found the phantom invoices. $3.8 million billed to my family trust by Coastal Elegance Catering, a company that doesn't exist. Never existed. No registered agent, no physical address, no employees, no tax filings. But the invoices bore my digital signature, a signature I never created. Someone had generated a digital certificate in my name and used it to authorize payments from the trust to a shell company for nearly 2 decades. And then my daughter called. Bethany, 36, pediatric surgeon. The child I raised while Victor traveled, the girl I drove to swim practice and helped with college applications and paid through medical school. She called to say she was flying home to support me through this difficult time. She said she was worried about me. She said the grief was lasting too long and maybe we should talk about adjusting my medication. She arrived on a Thursday. She held my hand. She sat with me in Dr. Kaplan's office and cried real tears, the kind that make your nose run and your voice crack. And that same week, while she was sleeping in her childhood bedroom, I found the 23 backdated trust amendments that gave her sole control of my family inheritance. Every document prepared by Marcus, Bethany's husband, Victor's financial advisor, for a decade. I want you to understand the architecture of this. Victor needed to access my family money. The prenup I'd insisted on, the one smart thing I did in 1984, prevented him from touching it while married. So the marriage had to end. Not through divorce, which would trigger the prenup's protections, but through death. His death, staged with a fake diagnosis, performed by my own daughter, using falsified pancreatic cancer imaging provided by a hospital colleague she was sleeping with. The body I identified through the viewing window at the funeral home was a John Doe from the county morgue, whose face had been reconstructed by a plastic surgeon Bethany knew from her residency, paid $95,000 in cash. My daughter held my hand at the memorial service, the same hand that signed away my grandmother's legacy. Here is where I stopped being a widow and became a trustee again. I had 72 hours. Marcus had scheduled a wire transfer of $1.4 million to a Panamanian foundation, and after that, the bankruptcy court's jurisdiction over the open probate would expire, and the money would be gone. 72 hours, and I could not let anyone know I was awake. I called Raymond Soto, forensic accountant. We'd worked together on 11 federal cases. I told him what I needed, and I told him the timeline, and I heard him exhale through his teeth, the way he does when a case is ugly, and then he said, "Send me everything." I did, from a laptop I'd purchased with cash at a Best Buy in King of Prussia, using a new email account I'd created at the public library. I called Judge Patricia Wynn. We'd served on the same bench for 15 years. I told her what I'd found. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said she'd have the emergency motion on the docket by morning. Then I did the hardest thing. I sat across from Bethany at dinner and I said, "I'm so grateful you're here." She poured me wine. She told me I looked tired. She suggested I take an extra dose of my medication to help me sleep. I said, "You're right, sweetheart." And I went upstairs and I poured the pills into the toilet and I worked until 4 in the morning, mapping 19 years of deception with the precision of a woman who'd done nothing else for 40 years, while my daughter slept peacefully in the room I'd wallpapered with butterflies when she was 6. The next day, Bethany went to the bank with Marcus to finalize the wire. I drove to a storage unit I'd rented under my maiden name and retrieved the copies I'd made, all of them, flight manifests, donation records, phantom invoices, trust amendments, the digital signature certificate, the funeral home's intake records for the John Doe. I put them in a fireproof box. I drove to Raymond's office. I said, "This is everything." He looked at the stack and said, "Eleanor, this is the most complete fraud package I've seen in 30 years. I said, "I had 40 years of practice." Then Celestine appeared at my door, Victor's Florida wife. I didn't know she existed until she was standing on my porch with a shoebox of letters, and I will tell you this. When she told me her name and said she was married to Victor Whitfield, I felt the floor tilt. Not because it was a surprise, not by then, but because she was real. She was a living, breathing woman with a wedding ring and a 12-year-old daughter and 19 years of marriage to a man who told her I was dead. She'd come to confront the monster. That's what Victor's letters described me as. 19 years of letters in that shoebox, each one painting me as a controlling, suspicious, cold woman who tracked his every movement, who suffocated him, who drove him to find love elsewhere. The irony sits in my chest like a stone. I couldn't access our bank account. I asked permission to buy groceries, and he described me as the controlling one. Celestine looked at me and I looked at her, and neither of us was what the other expected. She expected a monster. She found a woman in a cardigan making tea for one. I expected an accomplice. I found a woman who'd been lied to as thoroughly as I had. I almost lost everything that afternoon. Celestine's phone rang while we were talking. Victor. The caller ID said Vic with a heart emoji. She looked at me. I shook my head. She silenced it. But then he called again and again. And on the 4th call, she almost answered, her thumb hovering over the screen, and I said, "If you answer that phone, he'll know you're here, and he'll know I know, and everything I've built in the last 60 hours will disappear." She put the phone down. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. That was the closest I came to losing it all. 2 weeks later, I'd learned why Celestine kept those letters in a fireproof box. She'd had her own doubts. She'd been building her own quiet archive. Different instinct, same result. A woman who knew something was wrong and preserved the evidence even before she knew what it was evidence of. On Sunday morning, I flew to Miami. I wore a Navy suit I'd bought new. I carried a briefcase containing the federal court order, the forensic report, and the coroner's file for the John Doe buried under Victor's name. A federal marshal named David Hendricks met me at the airport. He lowered his sunglasses and said, "Ma'am, I've served papers in 23 states, and this is a first." Miami Faith Tabernacle seats 4,000. That morning it was full. Victor stood at the pulpit in a cream linen suit. He was preaching about marital fidelity. The irony was almost too much to hold. His voice was the same voice that had whispered goodbye from a hospice bed while I held his cooling hand. The same voice that had called about the Netflix password. The same voice that had told me for 40 years that my corners weren't tight enough, and my questions were too many, and my existence in rooms my own money paid for required his permission. I walked up the center aisle. 4,000 people turned to look. Victor saw me, and his face did something I will remember until the day I actually die. It collapsed. Not in fear, not in anger. In recognition. He knew. In that single second, looking at me walking toward him with a federal marshal and a briefcase, he knew that every thread of his 19-year fabrication had been pulled. I stood at the pulpit. Celestine stood in the balcony with her phone raised, live streaming to 14,000 followers. The hospice nurse finally told me what Victor whispered to her when I stepped out to cry. He'd said, "Make sure she watches." He wanted me to see him die. He wanted the image burned into me so I'd never question it. I read the coroner's report aloud. John Doe, approximate age 60, cause of death cardiac arrest, facial reconstruction performed post-mortem, burial under the name Victor Allen Whitfield. I read the flight manifests. I read the donation totals. I read Bethany's trust amendments. I read the phantom invoices signed with a digital signature I never created. Victor didn't move. He stood there in his cream suit while his congregation heard, some for the first time, that his first wife hadn't died in childbirth, that she was standing right here, that she was very much alive, that she was the one who'd found him. He didn't speak. There was nothing to say. The marshal served the papers. I turned around and walked back up the aisle. 4,000 people in silence. Celestine's livestream had 26,000 viewers by the time I reached the door. I didn't pursue criminal charges. I didn't need to. I filed the bankruptcy trustee's report reclassifying every donation to the ministry as marital fraud, which triggered an IRS investigation that froze every church account. Within 4 months, Victor lost his congregation, his Miami home, his pastoral license, and both wives. I saw a photograph of him 6 months later, working as a night security guard at a storage facility in Fort Lauderdale. He was wearing a uniform that didn't fit. I found our wedding album in his Miami study. Every photo of me had been cut out and replaced with Celestine's face, but he kept the photos of himself smiling. I looked at those photos for a long time. 40 years of smiling beside a hole where I used to be. Bethany's medical license is under review. Marcus is cooperating with federal investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. The trust amendments were voided. My grandmother's money came home. And the urn. The ceramic urn I'd talked to for 7 months, the one I'd said good morning to, the one I'd apologized to when I moved the furniture. I had the contents tested. Fireplace ash and concrete dust. I cleaned it out. I filled it with copies of every document that exposed his fraud, every receipt, every manifest, every amendment. I mailed it to Miami Faith Tabernacle with a note that read, "Now it contains something real." 3 months after the Sunday service, I stood in the kitchen of an adobe house in Santa Fe that I bought with cash from selling the Philadelphia estate. The light comes through the windows different here. It's golden. It lands on the terracotta floor and stays there like it's resting. I was making green chili stew from a recipe Celestine texted me, and I want you to sit with that for a moment, because the story you'd expect is that Celestine and I would be enemies. 2 women deceived by the same man, positioned against each other by his lies. Instead, she texted me a recipe, and I was cooking it. Preparing for tomorrow's Zoom call where we'd finalize our joint memoir proposal, 2 women writing the same story from opposite ends of his deception. It was the first meal I'd cooked for pleasure since 1987. I stood at the counter chopping green chilies, and I realized my hands weren't shaking. For 40 years, my hands shook when I cooked because Victor would taste the food and pause. That specific pause he did before he told me what was wrong with it. And my body had learned to anticipate that pause like a dog anticipates a raised hand. Standing in my kitchen in Santa Fe with no one coming through the door, no footsteps on the stairs, no throat clearing before the criticism, my hands were steady. I put down the knife. I put both palms flat on the counter. The tile was cool and rough under my skin. Through the window, I could see the Sangre de Cristo Mountains turning purple in the sunset, and the sky was doing that thing it does in New Mexico, where it becomes so wide you can't believe you lived your whole life under a smaller version of it. I breathed. I breathed all the way down to the bottom of my lungs, which I hadn't done since I was a young woman, because somewhere along the way I'd learned to breathe shallow, to take up less space, to exist quietly in rooms my money paid for. The house was silent. Not the silence of loneliness, not the silence of the Philadelphia house where every creak could be Victor's footstep, but the silence of a space that belongs to you and only you. The silence of a door with a lock that only you have the key to. The silence of choosing, for the first time in 4 decades, what to have for dinner without anyone's permission. I cried in that kitchen, not from sadness, not from anger, from the specific physical sensation of a knot loosening in my chest that had been tied so long I'd forgotten it was there. My body processed what my mind had engineered. The green chiles blurred in front of me, and I laughed through the tears because I was crying over stew. And then I cried harder, because I understood that I wasn't crying over stew at all. I was crying because I was free, and my hands were steady, and the mountains were purple, and no one, not one person in this entire world, was going to walk through that door and tell me I'd done it wrong. I want to talk to you directly for a moment. If you're listening to this and you're still inside it, still mapping the exits in your mind, still performing compliance while your real self lives in a locked room behind your eyes, I want you to know something. The advice people give, just leave, is the most useless sentence in the English language. Just leave. As if leaving doesn't require money you don't control. As if leaving doesn't require a place to go that they don't know about. As if leaving doesn't mean dismantling a life that took decades to build with someone watching your every move. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 9 men experience severe intimate partner violence in their lifetime. Financial abuse occurs in 98% of abusive relationships. It took me 96 hours to dismantle Victor's empire, but it took me 40 years to realize I was living inside one. If you're in the planning phase right now, if you're reading this with one eye on the door, know that your caution is not cowardice. It is intelligence. It is the same intelligence that kept you alive this long. Use it. Build your exit the way I built mine. 1 document at a time, 1 phone call at a time, 1 quiet morning at a time, until the architecture of your freedom is stronger than the architecture of your cage. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is 1-800-799-7233. They understand that leaving is a process, not a moment. This morning I woke up in my adobe house and made coffee in a mug I chose. I sat on my patio and watched the sun come up over the mountains, and I didn't check my phone for messages that might determine my mood for the day. I didn't listen for footsteps. I didn't arrange my face into the expression someone else required. I drank my coffee while it was hot, which sounds like nothing but is everything when you've spent 40 years letting yours go cold because his needs came first. Celestine and I talk twice a week now. Her daughter, the 12-year-old Victor, was teaching to drive, calls me Aunt Ellie, and I don't know what I did to deserve that, but I hold it carefully. We're writing the book together. 2 women who were told the other one was dead, finding each other in the wreckage and deciding to build something from it. The publisher said it's the most unusual memoir proposal they've ever received. I said, you should have seen the marriage. Victor is working nights at a storage facility in Fort Lauderdale. I don't think about him as much as you'd expect. When I do, I think about the wedding album. All those photos with my face cut out and hers pasted in. He couldn't erase me completely, though. In one photo from our reception, my hand is on his arm, and he missed it when he cut. My fingers are still there, resting on his sleeve, and they look steady. They look like they're holding on. It took me 40 years to let go and 60 hours to build a door, and I walked through it in a navy suit with a briefcase full of truth, and I never looked back. The urn sits on a shelf in Celestine's apartment now, empty. Just a beautiful piece of ceramic that held lies and then held truth and now holds nothing at all, which is a kind of peace I didn't know objects could have. If you've made it this far in this story, tell me, where are you listening from? What would you have done? Have you ever packed a bag in your mind while smiling at someone across the dinner table? Have you ever mapped an exit route while folding someone's laundry? I read every comment. I see you in them. If you're still inside it, I see you especially. Subscribe if this reached you. Share it if you know someone who needs to hear that the most strategic thing a trapped person can do is not run. It is plan. And then it is walk out the front door in broad daylight with a federal marshal and the truth. My corners are never tight enough. Victor's voice saying that still echoes sometimes, usually when I'm making the bed. But now I leave the corners loose on purpose. I pull the sheet up and let it fall however it falls, and I stand there looking at my imperfect bed in my own house in a state he's never set foot in, and I think, every wrinkle in this sheet is a rebellion, and then I get on with my day.